Okay, today, of course, is Father's Day. So today we're going to be talking, obviously, about parents and children, fathers and mothers. So when you think of your mother and your father, what are some of the roles that you remember them having in your upbringing, or what are some of the roles that you have in the upbringing of your children? And how are they different from each other? You from your wife or husband, and vice versa.
Of course, I know this is different today, but in our home, my dad was, always the breadwinner and went out and worked, and Mom ran the home, and of course, then she got to run the farm too. But yes, so breadwinner and.
Okay. So one was the primary role was going out and bringing home, the provisions, while the other one took care of the nurturing needs in the home. Okay, any others? All right. Well, anyway, in our 21st century Western society, fathers typically take the role of provider for the family, like you just gave as an example. Going outside the home to bring back the necessary resources to provide for the physical needs of the family. An example of this I can think of, and I was talking to Mom about it this morning. As an example, I asked her to refresh my memory on what exactly all the details were of it. But my nephew Landon, how old is he now, Mom?
Dad? He'll be a freshman this year.
Okay, so he's in high school, 14. So he's 14 years old now, but when he was younger, it was either Christmas or Easter, one of those holidays. We were having a dinner at the house, and he always loved Mom's homemade bread. And so Mom had fixed a bunch of homemade bread, rolls, of course, for the meal. And when it came time to eat, there was hardly any there. And he said, "Where'd all the bread go?" And apparently he'd been getting into it and eating some of it. And he said, "Landon, I think you've eaten the most bread tonight." And he said, "Does that make me the breadwinner?" So on the other side, mothers typically take the role of caregiver, comforter, or nurturer, taking care of the emotional needs of the family or the children. And an example of that I gave you guys recently was about my daughter Shannon. Whenever I corrected her when she was little, and then she would just suddenly burst out crying, even though I never touched her. All I had to do is just say her full name, say her first and middle name, and she just burst out in tears because she didn't want to disappoint me. And it broke her heart that she felt that she had disappointed me. And so one time I scolded her, and she took off running, crying, and I started to follow her to comfort her. And my wife said, "Stop! You stay out here. I'll take care of this." So she went in to comfort her, and so that was her role in that situation, was to provide the nurturing in the family. And so sometimes these roles do cross over, however, especially these days. They're often completely reversed, you can see sometimes. And while some will argue that may or may not be a good idea to switch those rules, and I do think it depends on the individual circumstances. There are times when it's just a necessity that you have to switch those roles, and sometimes it's a choice in this specific family. But at least they're being filled, those roles. And that's important for a family. It's better that somebody in the family fulfills those roles rather than they not be filled at all. Some examples are single parents, for whatever reason. Maybe it's because of divorce, or because of the death in the family, or some kind of physical separation, or even a spiritual separation of one or more of those caregivers. Whenever somebody's not in the home, for whatever reason, to provide that role, somebody else often has to step up to take over that role. And it's very difficult for a single mother or a single father to have to take on all those roles. And so that's where they need the support from their community, from grandparents and others to help them out in times like that whenever they're forced into such situations. As I said, grandparents are another example of that. Sometimes grandparents can fill those roles. Step-parents, adopted or foster parents, or some other form of surrogate or substitute parental figures. So we see that a lot in today's world and today's society, to where the nuclear family isn't pretty much, it basically isn't what it used to be. And so a lot of times we see those roles being filled by different people. Now, parents are essential to a child's upbringing. And when they're not there to fill those roles, it's one of the most detrimental things that we can have to the family today. And it's one of the main reasons, I think, that we have societal breakdown in these days. And when these parents are absent for whatever reason, not always necessarily their fault, but those others play a vital role in the child's life. Now, in biblical times, much of the parental roles were the same as ours today, with some exceptions. Now, in your family, which parent handled the spiritual teaching? Was it the mother or the father, predominantly? Mostly the mother? Does everybody pretty much agree with that? I think that's pretty common in our society today, and that was the case in our family as well. I attribute a lot of my spiritual upbringing to my mom, although Dad was, like you guys said, went out and provided by bringing home stuff. It was Mom that pretty much talked to us about the spiritual things. Of course, Dad didn't do much talking about those sorts of things, but you could see his faith in his actions and his insistence that we went to church. And he didn't just send us, he took us, went to church with us. And so he was a vital part of our spiritual upbringing as well. But when it comes to the actual teaching, usually that goes along to the mothers today. And sometimes that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes it's the fathers that take that role. And in biblical times, you'll see through the Old Testament especially, the fathers were told by God to pass on their spiritual heritage to the children. And so in those days, that was one of the exceptions to where it's different today than it was then with parental roles. Back then, fathers had a much stronger role, I believe, in the spiritual teaching of the children. There's an article by Thomas Nelson, which publishes the Thomas Nelson Bibles, and it says, while fathers are often identified as the parent responsible for setting the pattern for child rearing, mothers usually do much more of the training and instructing of families' children. Now, I imagine that this is largely because mothers more often are physically present in the home. Well, like we said, the fathers are at work, going out to bring home the bacon, so to speak, or to win the bread and bring it home for the family. But the article continues, mothers and fathers need to agree on their approach to child rearing and support one another in their efforts with their children. Now, I would say there's nothing worse, but I don't know if that's factual to say, but there's few things worse, at least, than when parents fight over how to raise the children. The children see it, and one of the things that results from that is they instinctively blame themselves for the disunity. And of course, that's not healthy to a child's self-confidence, to a child's growth, and to a child's spiritual well-being and emotional well-being, to feel that they're responsible for any disunity that's in the home. And so parents need to work together and lovingly come to an agreement on issues. Otherwise, the family will fall apart, as well as the children's lives, especially spiritually and even physically. Establishing a dysfunctional worldview that will negatively impact the rest of their lives. So parents, we need to work on our relationships in front of our children. Even if you're going through a divorce, you're going through a separation, or you are divorced, you want to try to have as much of an amicable relationship with each other, at least in front of the children, so that you don't show that division and contribute to their negative view of how parents and the adults in the family associate with each other. Because the way that we relate to each other is the same way that they, in the future, when they grow up, are going to relate to their spouses. And the way that we relate to our children is going to also influence directly the way that they relate to their future children. Now let's take a look at Ephesians chapter 5. That's in our Bibles. Again, that's on page 1823 in your Pew Bible. And if you have your own, we're reading from the New International Version. Ephesians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul describes the family roles. So we're going to look Ephesians chapter 5, beginning with verse 21. Ephesians chapter 5, beginning with verse 21. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Now hold your place here. We're going to continue in a little bit. So to summarize what we just read, there's a hierarchy of roles in the family. One is not more or less important than the other, but they are distinct and equal in importance. Just like the parts of the body, where Paul describes the church as different parts of the body of Christ. The eyes, the hands, and the feet are just as important as the head, and each part must accept its role in order for the body to function. Now, wives, or mothers to the children, are to submit and respect to the husbands, or fathers to the children, as the church submits to Christ, or in the body analogy, as the eyes, the hands, and the feet submit to the head, or the brain. I think of an example. If somebody touches fire with their hand, what's it going to do? It's going to burn them. It's going to burn your hand. It's going to hurt. But you don't feel the hurt unless that signal comes from the brain. The brain sends the signal to the hand, telling it that it's hurt. Or the fire sends the signal to the brain, then that lets you know, the brain lets the body know that it's hurt and tells the hand to pull back away from the fire. What if the hand didn't listen to the brain? Then it would continue to get burned, and it would hurt the body and eventually possibly kill it. Unity in the body, and in this case the family, is essential. Therefore, submission is essential, or the whole body will suffer and perhaps even die. Now, on the other hand, husbands, or fathers to the children, are also to love their wives as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. Now, in the body analogy, the husband must protect the wife and children as he would for his own body. The brain has to warn the hand about the fire. If the brain doesn't warn the hand, then it's not doing its part. And of course, it's going to harm the entire body. Both roles of the husband and wife are essential. And if they're neglected, then the body or the family will suffer and perhaps even die. And in all of this, as verse 21 says, both must submit to one another out of reverence for Christ and for respect and love for each other. Now we come to Ephesians chapter 6, and children come into the picture. In God's plan, the parents have already established their familial roles of love and respect. This is something that you do when you're dating, when you first start to build that relationship, then when you get married. So by the time you're having children in the way that it's designed here, you've already got that part of the equation established. So let's start reading here, Ephesians chapter 6, beginning with verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you, and that you may enjoy long life on earth. So this, of course, is a reference to the 10th commandment, or the 10 Commandments, specifically the 5th commandment from Exodus 20, chapter 12. Children, obey and respect your parents. Honor and obey them. taking their role in the body or family unit. Now, each body part must work in unity, and children are no exception. And just as the husbands to the submitting wives, parents are also told to treat their children with the same love, respect, and care. Let's continue with verse 4. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. And then the next few verses goes on to address the relationship between, in today's context would be employers and employees, but that's for another time. But suffice to say from this passage, our failures and successes will become our children's failures and or successes. We will influence our children for better or for worse. How we relate to each other, as I said, will directly influence how they relate to their future families. And how we relate to them will influence how they relate to their children. So basically we have the entire family working together as a body, each part taking on its own role for the benefit of the entire body. And it's done with love, honor, and respect for the Lord and for each other. And if each member takes on its own role, then the body or the family will be strong. And even when dangers, threats, and adversities rise, like for example the fire, where the brain tells the hand to stay out of the fire, they can stand firm against that trouble when it comes. As it continues in verses 10 through 20. So let's go ahead and pick up on the next page, page 1824, with Ephesians 6, beginning with verse 10. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore put on the full armor of God, so that when that day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. And then it goes on to describe the different elements of the sword, the shield, the armor that we put on spiritually to protect ourselves. Now, normally when we hear this passage, we think of spiritual warfare, and we think of maybe situations to where we're having spiritual warfare against the things out in the world that are rising up against us. But I find it interesting that this passage immediately follows where Paul is telling the family how to be a strong family together, about how husbands should relate to wives and vice versa, how parents should relate to children and vice versa. So I think that by the placement of this passage, Paul is directing this not only to us in a broader sense of spiritual warfare against the world, but specifically for families. When we take on those roles that he describes, we are building ourselves strong in the faith, and we're building our families up to make them strong so that they will be able to stand strong against those adversities that attack our families. So be strong, husbands and fathers. Be strong, wives and mothers. Be strong, children, in the Lord and in his mighty power. Take up your role in your family and put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. When all is done, having done all, to stand. Let us pray.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching today's program. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe so that you'll know when we add new videos. If you'd like to join us in person, we're at the Highland Ridge Community Church at 2200 Highland Ridge Road, Lowell, Ohio, 45744. We'd love to have you join us. Our Sunday morning services are at 9 o'clock a.m. every Sunday morning. In the meantime, you can find us online. Just search your social media for the keyword Pastor Kevin, HRCC. That's Pastor Kevin, HRCC. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next week. Thanks for watching, and God bless.